Well, Jane Kleeb is the author of Harvest the Vote, the chair of the Nebraska Democratic Party, and the president of Bold, Nebraska. She's kind enough to join me on the Climate Pod now. Jane, welcome to the Climate Pod.
Yeah, excited to be on. I am a big fan of podcasts as a way to get this info out to folks. So happy to join you.
Well, it's so great to have you on. You know, obviously, there's been so much news around pipelines in the last couple of weeks. And obviously, having a lot of people who are concerned about the climate crisis and the environmental crisis that are listening to this podcast, people have followed. Let's start with the Keystone XL pipeline. People have been following this for more than a decade. And, you know, obviously, President Biden, when he got into office, signed that order to revoke, the permit. But just last week, TC Energy said they're abandoning the pipeline, the zombie pipeline as well. They feel like it just couldn't die. And now not only has the permit been revoked, but TC Energy said they're moving on. You've been working on this for years. How did you feel when you heard that news last week?
So it was really just a huge sigh of relief because we have still are actually battling TransCanada in the courts. Even though their federal permit got rejected, they still technically have a state permit. So they've still been taking farmers and ranchers' land by eminent domain, even though we knew this pipeline was never going to be built with the economic issues, with the climate issues, with obviously the federal permitting issues. So this was a big sigh of relief for me, for farmers and ranchers, as well as our tribal allies who've been fighting this for over a decade together. And we felt like this was like the final nail in the coffin of this kind of like zombie that kept on popping back out of the ground and wanting to be built. But, this meant that we formed this like very unlikely alliance, right? Of like progressives, conservatives, independents, Democrats, Republicans, and we all stuck together. We never took a deal from Obama or TransCanada. And I think Keystone, as well as Standing Rock, really were two examples of how the climate movement's face has completely changed from what it was 15, 20 years ago.
Oh, yeah. I mean, that unity is so important. And you mentioned, not really budging on the end goal. But why do you think this was successful? What did you learn from this fight that can be carried on to, combating other pipelines?
Yeah, so there's definitely lots of lessons. One of the big ones was for funders. Normally in these climate fights, you would have foundations funding only the big green groups, NRDC, Sierra Club, League of Conservation Voter. We love them. They should still get funding. But they also at the same time funded all these like small ragtag groups along the pipeline route. So we had the resources to fight every single day, not just when somebody might pop in to do a press conference or might come and do an event with us, but we were there every day fighting and we had the resources to do it. Second, they didn't force a strategy onto us or a message. If I were to have walked into the church basements or the rodeos that I was organizing in to get landowners kind of organized and told them that unless they were fighting Keystone XL because of climate, we didn't want them part of the team, we would have definitely failed. So we had enough space from what the national strategy was doing to organize the way that we wanted to organize, which was for us, it was about protecting the land and water, respecting communities, property rights, the treaty rights of tribes. And I think third was never wavering on the target. And it became uncomfortable at times as a longtime Democrat. Here we were battling Obama and then putting out a climate pledge to all the Democratic presidential nominees, but really keeping their feet to the fire and keeping the basic concept in place, which is if you believe in climate change, if we're going to hit all of these climate goals, then we can't keep building fossil fuel projects. And that seems so basic, but it has been a real struggle, even still, to get Democratic politicians on our side with that statement.
Well, yeah, you mentioned the climate pledge. Tell me a little bit about that, because you have, candidates in the primary when they are trying to win over likely Democratic voters. You've got people, I believe, including President Biden, to sign that pledge. So what was that pledge that you had people sign?
We essentially went to the Democratic candidates and said, if you want our votes all along, the pipeline route, as well as obviously climate young people who were a force in the 2020 election cycle, you need to let us know that you're going to reject Keystone XL, that you're going to reverse the Dakota Access Pipeline permit, and that you're going to put in place this climate standard that essentially says all pipelines, all fossil fuel projects have to go through what Keystone XL went through, which is a rigorous test on water, on treaty rights, on property rights, and climate. And Biden really has set forth to the Army Corps a new standard. We're calling it the Biden standard that pipelines have to go through. But I think his administration is hoping that's just future pipelines. But we're like, no, no, no. We meant Dakota Access Pipeline, Line 3, all the rest of them that we're continuing to fight.
So there was a large amount of organizers for Line 3. Can you tell me a little bit about this Line 3 pipeline? Because this is, again, another pipeline people are organizing against. Why is it so important to be opposing the Line 3 pipeline if you care about climate?
Yeah, so about 12 years ago, when a lot of activists started fighting tar sands pipelines, tar sands companies, including TransCanada, Enbridge, and a couple others, essentially had plans to build about 10 tar sands pipelines from Alberta all through different parts of the United States to get to our coast, to get it to the export market. So this was always about how can Canada get their tar sands to the foreign export market. So Enbridge is a very similar sized pipeline to Keystone XL, carrying the same awful tar sands and all the chemicals they have to push through it, like benzene, in order to get it into liquid form. And it's still crossing, farmers and ranchers' land through eminent domain. It's crossing wild rice for us. It was crossing the Ponca sacred corn, but for the tribes up in Minnesota, it's their wild rice fields. So it's similar parallels.
Yeah.
I think the big difference of why Keystone got a lot of the attention and the resources and Line 3 didn't is Keystone kind of came out of the gate first. And that then came the entire focus, and a lot of funding and staffing and kind of resources went into that fight. And the Line 3 folks have been at it just as long as we have on Keystone. One thing was they weren't able to organize the landowners as fast, and because landowners already had an easement across their land. It's why these pipeline companies honestly really need to be stopped, because they can tell a farmer or rancher or a landowner, we're going to give you $20,000 for this pipeline easement. That's a permanent easement forever. They can put 2 pipelines, 3 pipelines, they can dig up an old pipeline, put a new one in, and their landowner gets no more money and no more say. And that's really what's happening in Minnesota right now.
Yeah, and as I mentioned, and I listened to a call that you were on with Joy Braun, who's a national pipelines organizer for the Indigenous Environmental Network, and I love what she said. She goes, "We are not protesters; we are water protectors." And I love the work everyone was doing last week to raise awareness for the issue, but also to properly frame this so that people really understood what was at stake and why there was resistance to this pipeline. Why do you think framing of this issue is so important to help people understand why people are resisting it?
I think big oil wants to continue to treat us as the other, right? Like we are some radicals, not like your brothers, sisters, or cousins. And so it's so easy to essentially say, oh, those are the radical environmentalists. It's much more difficult to say, we're fighting against water protectors or land defenders or farmers and ranchers. And so for us, that's more than just kind of branding. That's who we are. And it's why we are fighting these pipelines. We're fighting these pipelines to protect the water, to protect the land, to protect treaty rights of our tribal brothers and sisters. And so that was really important to us.
Dallas Goldtooth is a Keep It in the Ground campaign organizer for the Indigenous Environmental Network, and he joins us on the show now. We were just talking about what was at stake for Line 3, why it was so important to resist this pipeline, how this kind of compares to the Keystone XL pipeline. So I know, last week there's this large gathering of water protectors in Minnesota to march and raise awareness of the need to stop Line 3. How did that go?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think, first of all, it's really amazing to see, if you put it down on paper, the comparisons between Line 3 and Keystone XL. And a lot of the key issues that folks have been bringing up for years against Line 3 are pretty much the same arguments that were presented against Keystone XL. And, it's a mega tar sands pipeline project that is comparative to the same amount of coal-fired power plants in operation. I think it's over 50.
Right.
The amount of oil that's going through that pipeline is equal to over 50 coal-fired powered plants. It's always a tongue twister, that thing. It in its approval, has completely disregarded Indigenous rights and the input of Indigenous communities, who have said that this not only puts their communities at risk in the access to clean water, but also puts at risk significant cultural sites, places for people to gather their food. You know, Minnesota is known for wild rice. Well, this pipeline crosses numerous wild rice beds that a lot of local communities not only depend upon to feed their families, but also depend upon economically to put food on the table. And I think that, you know, what's at stake, I think what we've shown for the past 10 years is it's not just like a matter of protecting the homelands, the farmlands, the communities along the route, but it actually is a much bigger fight to protect this planet overall. And that if we are truly going to take climate action, if the president of this country really is sincere about taking climate action, then we're going to have to see the end of the fossil fuel era. We're going to have to see pipelines stop being made, because the best way that it was explained to me, and I love this analysis, there's this phrase that we use in our work called lock-in, is that when you build a pipeline, what the company is saying is that we're going to guarantee that we're going to have product to flow through this pipeline for the next 15 to 20 years. So by building the pipeline, you're locking yourself in to that 20 years of oil,
Right.
30 years of oil, 50 years of oil. So what's at stake is really the future of this planet and where we really want to go for the benefit of all of us.
Well, and how should President Biden act now to stop Line 3?
Well, I think there's a couple things, right? We on a very personal level, we want this president to stick to the promises he made. You know, he has told Indigenous communities, he's told frontline communities, Native and non-Native, white, Black, that he supports and understands the issues around environmental justice. He used the word fence line communities in some of his speeches. Well, these are the fence line communities who are telling him that he has to stop these projects. And just stick to those commitments is really what he can do. When it comes specifically to Line 3, review the permit. You know, the Line 3 got critical permits during the Trump administration. Everyone agrees that during the Trump administration, that administration was just throwing out permits left and right. Oh, you want a permit? You get a permit. You get a permit. You get a permit, with no consideration about how it may impact the environment. Well, just review those. I mean, this administration already says that it questions the decisions made during the Trump administration. Well, how about challenge and question the actual permits for the Line 3 pipeline, for other pipelines that have received permits via the Army Corps of Engineers? And so that's what we're asking, is just stop, follow your what you've said on the campaign trail, review the permits, and see if these projects impact communities in a negative way, if they violate treaty rights. And our argument is that they do. So,
yeah, and obviously President Biden acted very quickly on the Keystone XL pipeline. What is the administration saying about these other pipelines that you mentioned were approved under the Trump administration?
You know, I think they're essentially saying that they're taking all these facts into consideration, and they are meeting with kind of individual communities. And, you know, between Dallas and myself and many other kind of leaders, we're essentially telling the administration, mostly through the media and through podcasts like this, because it's not like Dallas and I have a, invitation to the White House. Even being chair of a party, we don't get special access to the White House. And so we're really using these types of community forums to say there is a simple task that you can do, and you actually don't need Joe Manchin or Kristen Sinema in order to get this done. You have the power within rulemaking with the Army Corps, with FERC, and other federal agencies to put a pause on these pipeline permits. So the water crossing permit at the Army Corps is the perfect example and thing to point out that Dallas mentioned, that for Line 3, it's also for Line 5 and several Byhalia pipeline down in Memphis with the Black landowners. They all have a water crossing permit with the Army Corps. Just press pause and say that we are going to follow the science. We're going to do a climate review. We're going to make sure that environmental justice is being considered. We're going to look at landowners' property rights, and then we'll decide if these pipelines actually deserve a permit. And if you look at the science, you will come to the conclusion of no. But that is what the administration needs to do. Now, I know all the arguments because I've been in politics now for 20 years that they're drinking out of a fire hose. They have a lot of priorities. They're balancing this very kind of political move because it will make some unions, not all. We have a lot of unions who are on our side, but it will make some unions upset because of the job argument. And so I understand all of that. But in the end, we all know that these pipelines should not continue to be built. And so there is a path that Biden can take, and it's actually a very easy path to say, we're going to follow the science on this one. And that doesn't mean that Dallas and I and all the other folks who fight pipelines don't care about our union brothers and sisters. Of course we do. We want them to have good paying, long-term jobs. We want them to make sure that they can provide for their family. And so for us, that means these clean energy jobs, which we know are sometimes $15 an hour jobs, don't have pensions, don't have healthcare, that should not be allowed. We should not continue to allow big wind and big solar to treat our communities like we're some, gig economy. Like, no, this is a real job. It should be union jobs. And that's what the Biden administration can also do with the American Jobs Act. He can require that those projects are union built.
And getting beyond the economics and the science, which is so clear, as many have pointed out, this is a treaty issue. We acknowledge treaties as binding agreements, the supreme law of the land. This is like core to what Americans tell themselves, like the mythology of America, right? Is the protection of the rule of law. So how are treaties being violated here with Line 3?
Well, I think that it's not just Line 3. That we saw this in Keystone XL. We saw this in Dakota Access Pipeline, which is still flowing for some reason, even though it does not have a permit. It does not have a federal permit to flow, but yet we've allowed it to continue to flow. And the courts have said this violates treaty rights. So I think that what I will say is I can speak to Line 3, but in doing so, I really want to ground this in history and ground this in a systemic failure of this country erasing Indigenous peoples from its history and erasing the distinct histories of how the federal government has interacted and worked or decimated Indigenous nations themselves. And treaties are a very big part of that. The treaty, there was a recent action most folks saw. I don't know if folks saw this action that happened last week in northern Minnesota, where there was arrests that were happening. Folks shut down a pumping station, and there was a Homeland Security helicopter operated by the Border Patrol that was on site, and it was 20 feet off the ground. And there were people like getting hit with all this debris, and there was a core argument that was being made, that continues to be made, is that folks are merely trying to enforce and enact to utilize their treaty rights to occupy the spaces that we've always occupied. Specifically in Minnesota on the Line 3 fight, it's the 1855 treaty. You can Google it. You can check it out yourself. The United States Congress signed off on it. They ratified that. The Anishinaabe Nations ratified that. And from our standpoint, from the tribe standpoint, we still like to honor those treaties. It's the opposite end, the United States, who has failed to honor those treaties. And so this movement is about so many different things. It's multi-layered. And I think people like to cop out by saying, oh, it's too complicated. Well, it's not really complicated. Like if we are committed to a future that our great-great-grandchildren can live and have quality lives, and also communities of color, poor communities can also have just as equal in quality nice quality lives, then we have to do something like stopping these projects. And so, yeah, I think that with the treaty rights argument, it was really beautiful. Is there was a moment I'm thinking of just 2 days ago. It happened 2 days ago. There was a photo taken of a bunch of white allies who were on treaty land at this camp that was along the path of the Line 3 pipeline. So It was 10 miles from the headwaters of the Mississippi River. The Enbridge is trying to cross underneath that river. And so folks set up a camp there to assert their treaty rights. And there was non-native folks or white allies who were there. And they lined up on the planks right there on the easement, and they held up signs that are written on their shirts. And it says, "We are all treaty people." And the teaching behind that is that oftentimes when we talk about treaties, mainstream society thinks, oh, that's a Native issue. That's a Native American thing. They're fighting for their treaty rights. But we often forget that a treaty is an agreement between two parties, and that as U.S. citizens, you are just as much a part of that treaty as the tribal nations themselves. And so the idea is that by upholding the treaties, by recognizing the sovereignty of tribal nations and recognizing their ability to decide what happens to their water or their bodies, not only empowers them, but it empowers us and everybody, all citizens who are part of that agreement. And we have proven time after time by supporting Indigenous rights, supporting tribal nations in their path to self-determination, helps protect the planet. So we all benefit from that. That's the core teaching, and I love seeing that. I love seeing that in that one photo. You can check it out on the various social media channels.
So how widespread is this problem with new pipelines? I mean, how many are in development that need to be opposed?
You know, if you go to pipelinefighters.org, we actually list out about 9 different pipelines to help kind of educate the community, the press, and even politicians, because we often hear that there's so many pipelines, it's confusing. So we were like, okay, we'll take that challenge on. Go to pipelinefighters.org, and you can see the maps of the different pipelines, what's at risk with the pipelines, where it's at in the permitting process, what legal fights, and most importantly, what groups are fighting these pipelines on the ground. So the ones that we're currently really pushing the administration are Line 3 in Minnesota, Line 5, which Governor Whitmer is tough and standing strong against Enbridge from crossing the beautiful water up in Michigan. Then there's the Byhalia pipeline down in Memphis that is really affecting Black landowners. Mountain Valley Pipeline, MVP for short, is both in West Virginia, but also North Carolina. Then there's Penn East, which is a big eminent domain challenge in New Jersey. And then there's Jordan Cove out in Oregon, which is really on its last leg, but still has a couple more court challenges. And of course, the Dakota Access Pipeline, Standing Rock. So those are the big ones that we're continuing to push. There's lots of other pipeline fights, especially down in Texas, where big oil continues to just go wherever they want, unregulated essentially. But those are the ones that Biden can really step in and make a difference and not need Congress to help him stop those projects.
Yeah, beyond the Biden administration, you mentioned Governor Whitmer. Are there other avenues you can explore to get these pipelines stopped?
You can always be challenging eminent domain for private gain. So that's something that, you know, we used as a tool here in Nebraska. They're using it on the Penn East pipeline, Mountain Valley pipeline as well. That right now is state by state for oil and tar sands pipelines, but it's under a federal FERC, this is the Natural Gas Pipeline Agency at the federal level. They determine eminent domain for fracked gas pipelines. But Congress really could step in, and Representative Raskin is one of the leaders that's really pushing on eminent domain, and Merkley in the Senate, where they're essentially saying, we have got to rethink how we did eminent domain in the 20s and 30s when railroads essentially were using it, and, you know, we were building highways across America, that we should not be allowing private for-profit, especially export pipelines, to be using eminent domain for their private gain. Quite frankly, I would love to see a bill that both honors the sovereign rights of Native American nations and respects people's property rights to determine how they're going to utilize their land. And, you know, Dallas and I both, as we're fighting these pipelines, there's also a movement that Native Americans have been pushing about land back. But this is not only about making sure that Native Americans get land back. This is also about Black farmers who used to own 15% of the farmland and now own less than 1%. Like, there's a real inequity about the way that land is distributed in the United States. And when you have land, you can create wealth. And when you can create wealth, you have a more stable relationship for your family and future generations. And so that's also what this is about. It's about who gets to create wealth, who determines that wealth, and that's deeply connected to the land.
I know going back to line three, I saw on Monday the Minnesota Court of Appeals affirmed this certificate of need and routing permit that was granted by the Minnesota Public Utilities Commission. What does a court decision like that mean for the future of this pipeline?
It's not the end of this fight against the pipeline. I'll say that. And both between Jane and I and many other pipeline fighters, we've encountered many bad decisions and many good decisions in this struggle. And we've proven that with tenacity that we have faith in our organizing capacity. So I think that the folks on the ground have been very resilient in that and saying, look, they're going to continue to push the legal challenges where they can. They're going to continue to push the administrative challenges where they can, and they're going to continue to push on the physical challenge and physical fights on the ground itself to delay construction. I think that is actually what's really beautiful about this movement, that I think often people don't give it enough love or understanding, is that we're thorough. Like, if there is an opportunity for us to stop this project, we're going to take that opportunity. And, so like folks are going after the financiers of these projects. Line 3, there's a massive defund Line 3 campaign that's going right now to target the banks who are giving billions of dollars to Enbridge. There's a whole movement on the state level and the national level to call to question all the permitting and that whole entire process, as we've been explaining. And so I think that's powerful. And I think we just need to continue to build that echo chamber, that we need systemic change really across the board. So, yeah.
Well, the work you've both done to, resist the Keystone XL pipeline and finally kill that zombie pipeline has taught me, and I think so many of the people who are interested in these issues, just how this works and why it's so important to oppose these new pipelines. And I was noticing last week during the organizing against Line 3, it was getting a lot of media attention. It seemed like it was breaking through a lot of that media noise and starting to get some recognition. You both have large followings. You've been tweeting about it and sharing more information. How do you start to raise the media awareness, just like Keystone XL had, so that it becomes, prominent enough that the president has to speak directly to it?
It's a matter of doing constant actions, right? So if we were to have relied on one strategy or one action on Keystone XL, there's no question that pipeline would be in the ground and operating. But instead, we've outlived, I think, 3 CEOs and a name change with TransCanada, because whether it was building barns in the route or clean energy in the route or bringing teepees and horses to go through the streets of DC, carving pumpkins. I mean, you name the action, we definitely did it here along the pipeline route. And the same thing in Minnesota. And so, if Winona and Tara were on the line, 2 of those, strongest leaders, and Dawn in Minnesota, they would say, like, they've been literally doing so many actions to get to the point that media finally kind of broke through 2 weekends ago. So it was definitely like a build, actions. And they're not giving up, like so many actions still. So even that lawsuit where, 2 opinions against 1, the dissent though was just amazing and strong. And I think we are wanting to send copies of that to the White House, because everything that judge said is exactly the right strategy if you do care about climate and you care about treaty rights. So for me, even though we lost that particular court fight, the dissent really backs up what activists and water protectors and landowners have been saying on the ground.
Enbridge is out making an argument. They're saying that, hey, we're just simply replacing an old leaky pipeline with a better one. This isn't a new pipeline. What do you make of that argument?
I would say if you are digging an entirely new path, you're clear cutting hundreds of miles of trees. If you are bringing in entirely new pipelines and building hundreds of miles of new pipe, that's not a replacement. That's a new pipeline. Folks may not get that. Like, Line 3, there is a line 3 in the ground right now that is over 60 years old, that is leaking in some places. And you can go on right now and find photos. There's parts of the pipeline that is currently in place that Enbridge has that they're trying to replace that's exposed. You can see it like in a marshland in critical waters, just exposed. Right. And they want to replace hundreds of miles of it, but that's not a replacement. They're building a brand new pipeline, and their plans are, is once it's in the ground, to up the pressure and increase its capacity to go beyond what the original pipeline was transporting. So it's a farce. It's a complete farce, this idea of a replacement pipeline. And there's a number of tribes who they're in. The other thing that the Enbridge likes to use is like you know how the word greenwashing, the word greenwashing, where they pay money to make it look like they're doing a good thing. Well, there's also red washing. That's a term I use, is like they will find Indigenous communities who will sign off on their project. And then they'll say, look, we got these Indians on board who say it's okay. Well, in this case on line 3, one of the tribes that did sign an agreement with them were bullied into it. I mean, they were like, look, Enbridge came to them and said, look, you can fight us, but it's going to cost you tens of millions of dollars. Do you have that money? And they were bullied into a situation where they're like, yeah, it's either we go bankrupt or we try to fight this company. And back then, this was like 5-6 years ago, no one knew about line 3. So that's the situation you also have to be mindful of, is that they are bullying people into believing that this is something good, that this is a project. Before they were bullied, they were on board with the idea of like, hey, we don't want any pipeline across our lands. None of it. Dig them all up, take them out, but also remediate the land back to the way it was. So, yeah.
Yeah, it just does extraordinary environmental damage. It harms people directly. As you mentioned, I mean, these pipelines are bound to leak. That's what all the information we have tells us. These pipelines will leak. And the fact that we're increasing capacity for oil pipelines at a time when we need to be decarbonizing and electrifying everything is so tragic. And I know, Jane, I saw you tell Bloomberg this, quote, if you need and want us, as I know the Biden team does, to come out in stronger numbers for 2022, then you have to do right by our community, unquote. How will likely Democratic voters feel if the Biden administration isn't doing what they can and revoking, permits for these pipelines?
We expect Democrats to act differently than Republicans. Like, that is fundamental. So using the levers of the power that you already have within the government means utilizing that power and the kind of, voting will that we just gave you to do right by our communities. That means a lot of things. That definitely means rejecting these permits because we don't need these pipelines, and it risks our water, increases climate, all the issues that we've talked about. But it also means building clean energy in a good way as well, right? So not coming in and telling, look, I always try to remind a lot of my kind of Democratic allies that live mostly kind of on the coast that in the rural communities, we're the ones that have all of the land that a lot of these clean energy projects are going to need to be built on. That's tribal land as well as kind of ag and other open land in rural communities. We should be the ones at the table deciding where these projects are being built, who builds, who generates the wealth, where the transmission lines are going to go, et cetera, et cetera. But all of these decisions sometimes get lost in the shuffle of now the focus of everybody in DC is on Manchin and Sinema. I'm sorry, but we have to start breaking out of this cycle of we need these 50 votes or 51 votes, and now we need 60 votes. We have the ability to do good by our communities without Manchin and Sinema. Start doing that to prove to voters that if we keep on electing Joe Biden, if we make the majority stronger in the House and in the Senate, we'll be able to do bigger and bolder and better things for our communities. If not, then when Dallas and I go to the doors, or when we're, giving speeches on college campuses, young people and older voters are going to tell us nothing changed. Nothing was different between Trump and Biden. It was the same. And I know that Joe Biden doesn't want to be like that. He has served his entire life helping people in the government. He knows that the government can be and should be a force for the people rather than big corporations. So now's the time to prove it. And we have Deb Haaland at the Secretary of Interior. We have Vilsack at the Department of Ag. We have all these other good kind of folks who are in government right now. So use your power for good. That's what we're asking you to do.
If the only thing I would add is, our campaign is called Stop Trump's Pipelines. Stop Trump's Pipelines. I'm pretty sure the president does not want this campaign to become Stop Biden's Pipelines. But that's the direction where we're going. And if the president wants to stop that, he can take some actions. And we've provided the path for him. So I really want to say that, like, what Jane is absolutely spot on. Like, the people have given him a mandate, especially like the communities who tend to not come out in droves to vote, came out in droves to vote for Biden. And along with that became a strong mandate to stand up and protect communities of color, poor communities as we move forward. And if we don't get that mandate, if that's not achieved, you will hear from the people. You will hear from the folks. And that's the way it goes. That's how democracy works. We have to hold our leaders accountable.
Well, yeah, and all of these people came out to vote for President Biden, running on a platform of bold climate action and centering environmental justice. So many people organized and came out to vote for that. So how do you feel if the president doesn't act on these pipelines? How will you feel about those campaign promises?
No, there'll be broken promises, and it will become very uncomfortable for all of us who believe in Democrats, that Democrats are clearly better than Republicans on all the issues that we care about: healthcare, education, climate, et cetera. But if you're not going to stand up and be bold and do right by our communities, what does that tell voters? It tells voters that we're no better, and that the status quo is essentially the line that we now have to give folks. And it does not have to be that way. Like, we have been telling communities, just wait 20 more years. Let's have a bridge fuel of fracked gas. Now they're telling us, wait, we're going to build these carbon capture pipelines all over the United States. Like, no, I'm sorry. Like, that's all helping fossil fuels continue to do business as usual. We have to turn the page on fossil fuels. We have to build clean energy in the right way. And Biden has the ability to do that. Now, we also have his back when it comes to the American Jobs Act. We have his back on the 30 by 30 plan. Many of our groups are in rural communities doing the work for the White House. We're saying, no, conservative right-wing media. 30 by 30 is not a land grab. What is a land grab is Keystone XL, Inline 3, and all these other pipelines that Republicans support. We're talking about putting land in conservation easements so the wildlife and the water and the land can be protected. But, it is a big problem that Democrats have. They shrink when it comes to rural issues. They shrink when it comes to uncomfortable issues. And pipelines are uncomfortable because some of the unions support them. This is not a time to shrink. And Joe Biden is a fighter. So get in there and make the case. When we make the case to voters, even when they disagree with us, they at least know that they can trust us. And that is what Joe Biden won on, I deeply believe. He won the Democratic primary because he explained the differences between him, Bernie Sanders, and others. And voters were like, okay, I may not agree with Biden on everything, but at least I know where he stands. At least I know I can trust him and that he's going to have my back. And that's what we're asking him to do. Have working class and barely working class voters backs for once, not these big corporations and not a handful of unions who, quite honestly, vote for Republicans and side with big oil more than they do Democrats anyway.
I would love to add that the solutions are coming from the communities themselves. Like that's what I'm hearing from you, Jane. It's like the solutions are coming from the frontline communities, from working class communities, from poor class communities who are basically forced in a situation where they have no choice but to come up to the solutions to the problems around them. And I find inspiration in the work that we did on Keystone XL. I mean, I was in rooms that, and Bold Alliance was very much a part of that, to organize landowners who oftentimes, some of the landowners I got to sit down with and talk about our issues around treaty rights were like hard, like right-wing Republicans. And just sitting down and talking about the commonalities of this fight and talking about what the issues, they got onto our side. Where you had like a strong right-wing Republican where it's like, yeah, yeah, these Indians really did get screwed over. They deserve better. We need to respect their rights. And Native folks are saying, yeah, we support landowner rights. There's a space here for us to come to some recognition, but that's coming out of the frontline work that I feel like the mainstream Democrats are not taking notice of or taking advantage of and getting Biden into the White House. Look, folks put in a lot of work. These same folks that put in a lot of work are setting the path for a better country for all of us. So really, I really encourage folks to pay attention to that.
So there's much more work to be done. And I know Enbridge said that this larger capacity Line 3 pipeline is on track to go into operation in the fourth quarter of the year. So how can we raise awareness and form greater resistance in the meantime?
I think, like I said, there's different points of access for folks, right? One is that we're encouraging folks to continue to put pressure on Biden in the social media and any chance possible to connect him to these fights. I think that's what the White House doesn't want, is for their name to be attached to these projects. So we're going to do that. We're going to attach the name to these projects, saying this is on you now. This is on your dinner table. You're eating this. You have a choice whether to put it aside or not. I think that's one key aspect of this. There are also, like I mentioned before, there's this whole divestment campaign of like pulling out resources of the corporations who are giving money for the pulling your money out of the banks who are giving money to Enbridge and to other projects. If you are a city administrator, if you run any kind of institution, there's a good chance you're investing your money somewhere where here's a good chance for you to be on board with this fight and say, okay, our city's not going to invest in a company that is destroying the planet. Those are really great ways to create this echo chamber for great, tremendous change. And I think, honestly, I would be remiss to not mention it, but there are folks who are also committed to support on the ground in Line 3 in creative actions in solidarity with Native folks and landowners in different forms of civil disobedience and nonviolent direct action as a way to slow down the machine as it's coming forth. Those are all electives and things that people can volunteer for. So it's like, really, you have a whole choice, a whole range of options here.
Yeah, they're the organizing events last week that I mentioned that got a lot of attention. Anything similar like that going to happen the rest of the summer?
I think you are for sure going to see things heated up as things go forward. And when I say that, I'm not saying it I don't mean to come off very lighthearted. Like, we're going to continue to see state-sanctioned violence perpetrated upon peaceful water protectors. We're going to still see a lot of people on the ground who are going to be monitored, harassed, and followed by pipeline workers. One of the key arguments against these projects that a lot of Native communities have been saying for years and years and years is the high risk of sexual violence that comes along with these extractive industries, specifically pipelines. And that has proven true, very sadly. A couple of months back in February of this year, 2 Enbridge pipeline workers were caught in a sex trafficking ring in northern Minnesota along the Line 3 pipeline. So we've been saying this for years. No one's been paying attention, but it's coming true. And so we're going to continue to see the elevated chances of risk. We're going to still continue to see state-sanctioned violence, but we're also going to see people taking beautiful actions and enacting beautiful resistance to this project. Enbridge plans to cross the rivers and waterways within the next 30 days. They're already getting their equipment set up on them along some of those key rivers. And so I just ask for a lot of solidarity, love, and energy to the land defenders, the water protectors, the pipeline fighters who are putting their lives on the line and just doing whatever they can as individuals to delay construction.
We did a show a couple of weeks ago where we were talking about the way broadcast TV news has covered environmental justice issues, and something like resistance against a pipeline for in the case of Dakota Access, did get a lot of coverage, but there wasn't much depth, and people were not left with a real understanding, again, of the stakes and the kind of damage that's posed. I'm curious, from your perspective, you guys do a lot of media, you're witnessing a lot of media covering these events that you're at. How would you like to see media coverage improve when it comes to Line 3 or any of the other pipelines you're opposing?
I definitely want media to come not only when the police are beating up water protectors and land defenders, right? Like, I understand that that is an important thing to cover, and we want them to cover when that violence is happening. But I also want them to get their feet on the soil and touch the water and truly see what we are protecting. When I was in Minnesota, we were at a bar after a long day of actions, and there became this confrontation with some local folks. And I won't go through the whole story, but the bottom line for me was they had a true misunderstanding about why we were there to try to stop the pipeline. And I think the environment versus jobs, which is always the narrative that media takes, or environment versus cops, I would rather them tell the stories of why we are risking arrest to defend the land and water, and what is the history of the land that is now being potentially destroyed by this particular pipeline. What are the levers that Biden can be taken to reject Line 3 and other pipelines? Like, really dig into those stories. And I think a lot of print is doing that. Podcasts clearly are, but MSNBC, CNN, clearly Fox News, they are not doing that. I think Joy Reid was the only show on MSNBC that actually had Jane Fonda and Tara on. And it was so I deeply appreciate Joy Reid. She did a good job covering Keystone back in the day as well. But come on, I mean, tell our stories. That's what we're asking. We're asking them to tell our stories, because Americans need to start connecting the dots that when we say we want climate action, that's not just more windmills and solar panels, although that's obviously something that we support. It also means stopping these risky projects.
You mentioned the environment versus jobs framing. Do you think COVID is complicated the way the story is being framed?
I think some of that, you really couldn't have mass protests and mass demonstrations, obviously, during COVID. So
Right.
A lot of it was online. But I just think it's an easy narrative to say, because it also is exactly what big oil wants. And that's what all of their media people are pushing. And if we don't think that that's happening, then, you're really naive. Big oil and fracked gas companies love when unions and environmentalists are at each other's throats, because then they go through the middle and get their economic plan and pipeline in the ground. So that is something that we honestly try to avoid. I mean, I clearly want union folks to have good paying jobs, as I talked about several times. And I also think that they have to be called out for siding with corporations that hurt our communities and our families. And having that honest conversation is important within the Democratic Party and within the media.
Dallas, you talked about these are obviously incredibly hard challenges that what people are sacrificing, and in terms of their time, putting themselves in danger. It's extraordinarily inspiring. And you talked about some of the beauty and the unity when you see these organizing demonstrations. This has both clearly meant a lot to your lives. When you look back at the last years, we were talking earlier about the moment when TC Energy eventually had abandoned the Keystone XL pipeline. What has this meant for you personally?
I was always a very I feel like I was very politically aware about the greater social justice issues. I went to UC Berkeley. I was politicized in that space. I grew up in the movement. My dad's been an organizer in the environmental justice movement, but I really didn't put that into operation until the fight against Keystone XL. And it was the tremendous work of so many nameless people, and watching what they put into it, right? Of this common, just people, just regular folks who are either drive their postal, they work for the post office, or they're ranchers, or they just hanging out, people dedicating so much time to protect the planet, to protect their community, to protect their backyards, to protect everything around them, has been so empowering. But it also has shown me that resistance is beautiful when people are focused on this idea that we all deserve better across this planet, that every person, no matter where you're from, no matter your socioeconomic background, all deserve a healthy and happy life. And I think that, I have learned this saying once. I forgot, I was at some event training where they're training people on, civil disobedience work, and someone was talking about resistance art and banner making and like, how do you tell the story? And they're like, our job is to make our resistance, to make this movement irresistible. Like, that's what it's about, because what we're doing is we're celebrating life. We're advocating for life. And many times people think that this movement to stop these pipelines is a fight against something. No, it is a fight for something. It is a fight for something better for every one of us and for the next 7 generations of life on this planet. That's what it's about. That's what draws me in and inspires me, is to see folks who are willing to travel, who are willing to put their lives on the line, who are willing to show up at their bank and say, yo, you're financing the violation of human rights. Like, those are things that are really beautiful and empowering, because that's what people power is. That's what organizing is. That's what democracy is about. And so, yeah, that's what I've learned over the years in this fight.
Jane, how about you?
I definitely learned that people want to be asked to be part of something bigger than themselves. And a lot of the emails and phone calls that I've been getting from the past couple of weeks of pipeline fighters, either that had land in the route or people that maybe went to a march, they're thankful that they were asked to stand up and stand with others in order to defend something. And I think that, as an organizer, we know that in our bones, that in order to have a good fight, in order to win a campaign, you do have to ask people to get out of their comfort zone and to be part of a community. And I learned I've worked on lots of different campaigns, whether it was against eating disorders or helping pass Obamacare, helping unions with card check. I've, worked on various political campaigns, but pipeline fights in particular, and environmental justice fights also, when, fighting coal plants, when you bring urban and rural together, for me, that was the biggest lesson that we learned on Keystone XL, that in fact, we have so many shared values and that we want the same things for our family and our community. And that big oil and all these other corporations really do want to keep us divided so they can continue to get their way. For me, that was the biggest lesson. And I think for farmers and ranchers who had stereotypes about urban folks and urban folks who had stereotypes about rural people, that really melted away within one action that you participated in on these pipeline fights. So I think we need to take that lesson into other kind of, issue organizing. We clearly, that's why I wrote Harvest the Vote, was to tell Democrats, like, you've got to get out of this only talking to people who agree with you and start making the case on why we do need Medicare for all, why we do need to stop pipelines, why we need to end eminent domain. And, the list is long.
Well, one more time for people listening, where should they go? What should they do? They've listened to this podcast. They want to get involved with stopping pipelines. Where should they go online?
They can get a good overview of pipelines at pipelinefighters.org. That links to a lot of our other group sites. And then if you want to look at the ads that we're pushing against, even some of our allies, including President Biden, go to stoptrumppipelines.org. You can check out Bold at Bold, Nebraska, and Dallas can give you all his sites too.
Yeah, you can check out Indigenous Environmental Network. We're on all social media channels, usually the acronym IEN Earth, and follow along. And, we're very much involved in supporting a lot of the frontline fights in northern Minnesota against Line 3. So you can follow those, see those on social media, and find ways to support there as well in those frontline led fights.
We will link to all of that in the show notes. Jane Kleeb, Dallas Goldtooth, thank you so much for joining me on the Climate Pod.
Hey, I'm so happy to be here. Thank you very much, and much love.
See y'all.